The loudest person in the room is not always the strongest. Sometimes the quietest one changes every life without raising her voice. On a cool autumn afternoon in Manhattan, the lunch crowd filled one of the city's most elegant restaurants with the familiar rhythm of polished silverware, quiet conversations, and the soft melody of a piano drifting through the dining room. Business leaders discussed contracts worth millions of dollars while tourists admired the skyline beyond the tall windows. Every table seemed to tell a different story, but none of the guests noticed the shy waitress moving gracefully between them with calm eyes and an unhurried smile. Emily Carter wore a neatly pressed white shirt beneath a black apron, her light brown hair tucked carefully behind her ears. She greeted every customer with the same gentle kindness, whether they ordered an expensive steak or a simple cup of coffee. Few people looked beyond the apron. Even fewer realized the thoughtful young woman quietly observing every detail around her possessed a remarkably disciplined mind hidden beneath an ordinary job. At exactly 12:15, the front doors opened once again. Daniel Brooks entered the restaurant with long, confident strides, wearing a tailored navy suit and an expression that suggested time itself struggled to keep pace with him. As the founder of one of New York's most successful investment companies, he had built an extraordinary career through relentless discipline, impossible standards, and an uncompromising personality that many admired but even more feared. Beside him walked his 11-year-old son, Ethan, carrying a backpack over one shoulder while trying to match his father's hurried pace. The restaurant manager personally welcomed Daniel and escorted them toward a reserved table near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Employees quietly exchanged nervous glances. Everyone recognized the billionaire whose temper had become almost as famous as his business success. Emily approached their table carrying 2 menus and 2 glasses of water. Her voice remained soft and professional. "Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Emily, and I will be taking care of you today." Daniel barely looked up from the business call playing through his wireless earpiece. He nodded once before continuing his conversation about an important acquisition. Ethan offered Emily a polite smile instead. Several minutes later, Emily returned with fresh coffee just as Daniel ended his call. She carefully placed the cup beside him, but at that exact moment, another customer accidentally brushed against her shoulder while walking past. Only a few drops of coffee landed on the polished table beside Daniel's documents. None reached his suit. None touched him. Yet Daniel immediately stood, his chair sliding sharply across the hardwood floor. Every nearby conversation stopped. "Do you have any idea how important these papers are?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the restaurant. Emily immediately reached for a clean linen napkin. "I am very sorry, sir. I will replace everything immediately." Daniel looked at the damp corner of one document before shaking his head with visible frustration. Sorry does not solve carelessness. The dining room fell completely silent. Dozens of strangers watched the young waitress standing alone before one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. Ethan lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. Emily finished drying the table, then slowly looked up. Her expression remained calm. There was no anger, no fear, and no attempt to argue. She simply met Daniel's gaze with quiet dignity before speaking one sentence that no one inside the restaurant would ever forget. Respect is never measured by how we treat people after perfection. It is measured by how we treat them after a mistake. Daniel Brooks did not answer immediately. The restaurant remained so quiet that even the distant piano seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Every guest expected the young waitress to lower her eyes, apologize again, or quietly walk away. Emily Carter did none of those things. She simply stood with composed posture, her hands resting gently around the folded linen napkin she had used to dry the table. There was no challenge in her expression, only calm honesty. Daniel looked at her for another long second before letting out a slow breath. "You are giving me a lesson now?" His voice was quieter than before, but the sharp edge remained. Emily answered with the same respectful tone. "No, sir. I am only accepting responsibility for my mistake while hoping we can both leave this moment with dignity." The sincerity in her words surprised several customers sitting nearby. Ethan glanced from his father to Emily, clearly waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel slowly sat back down without saying another word. Emily immediately replaced the damp documents with clean protective folders supplied by the restaurant manager, brought a fresh cup of coffee without charging for it, and carefully organized the table exactly as it had been before the accident. She never hurried. She never appeared nervous. Within only a few minutes, the dining room gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed. Plates arrived from the kitchen. The piano softly filled the room again. Yet Daniel found himself watching the quiet waitress each time she passed another table. She smiled warmly at an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary. She patiently helped a young family choose meals for two small children. She remembered a regular customer's favorite soup without asking. Every interaction carried the same quiet respect she had shown him despite his temper only moments earlier. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Dad, I do not think she meant to spill the coffee." Daniel looked toward the window before answering. "Intent does not erase mistakes." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe, but she fixed it without blaming anyone else." Daniel did not respond. Instead, he opened the business folder lying before him. A few minutes later, Emily returned to take their lunch order. Her voice remained as warm and professional as when they first arrived. There was no trace of resentment. "Have you decided what you would like today?" Daniel studied her face carefully, almost expecting to find irritation hidden beneath her polite smile. He found none. "The grilled salmon," he answered quietly. Ethan smiled. "I will have the chicken sandwich, please." Emily wrote the order neatly. "Excellent choices. I will have everything ready shortly." As she turned away, another waiter approached carrying a heavy serving tray. The narrow aisle forced both employees to adjust their steps. Emily instinctively moved aside first, allowing her coworker to pass comfortably before continuing toward the kitchen. It was such a small gesture that almost no one noticed. Daniel did. He watched how naturally she placed other people ahead of herself, even when nobody was paying attention. 20 minutes later, their meals arrived perfectly prepared. Before leaving the table, Emily noticed Ethan quietly staring at the mathematics worksheet sticking halfway out of his backpack. "Big test coming up?" she asked with a gentle smile. Ethan laughed shyly. "Tomorrow." Emily nodded encouragingly. "Just remember that understanding why an answer works is always more valuable than memorizing the answer itself." Ethan smiled brighter. "I will remember that." Daniel looked up from his meal. The sentence sounded unexpectedly thoughtful for an ordinary conversation. Emily simply wished them an enjoyable lunch before walking away once again. Watching her disappear among the crowded tables, Daniel felt something unfamiliar replacing his frustration. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he stopped seeing only a waitress wearing a black apron. Quietly, almost against his own expectations, he began wondering who she really was. After lunch arrived, Daniel Brooks attempted to return his attention to the acquisition proposal resting beside his plate. It was one of the largest investments his company had considered all year, and the executive team expected his final decision before sunset. Yet every few minutes his concentration drifted toward the quiet waitress moving effortlessly through the crowded dining room. Emily Carter never appeared rushed despite the steady flow of customers. She listened before speaking, remembered small details about returning guests, and solved minor problems before they became complaints. It was a kind of quiet leadership Daniel rarely saw, even inside expensive boardrooms. Ethan finished half of his sandwich before opening the mathematics worksheet from his backpack. Several equations had been crossed out with frustrated pencil marks. Daniel noticed his son's expression. "Having trouble?" Ethan sighed softly. "The teacher says I keep memorizing formulas instead of understanding them." Daniel looked briefly at the page, but his phone immediately vibrated with another business call. "Give me a minute," he answered without hesitation, discussing stock projections while Ethan quietly stared at the unfinished problems alone. A few minutes later, Emily approached to refill their water glasses. She noticed the worksheet, but never reached toward it. "How is lunch?" she asked warmly. Ethan smiled politely. "It is really good." Then he looked back at the paper with obvious frustration. Emily noticed the expression immediately. "Still thinking about tomorrow's test?" Ethan nodded. "I know the formula, but I do not understand why it works." Emily smiled gently. "May I ask you one question?" Ethan looked up with curiosity. "Sure." She pointed toward the window overlooking Fifth Avenue, where people hurried along the sidewalks below. If every person walked exactly the same path every day, would the city ever grow? Ethan blinked. Probably not. Emily nodded. Mathematics is similar. Formulas are useful paths, but understanding teaches you how to find new ones when the road changes. Ethan looked back at the equation. His eyes slowly brightened. So the answer is not the important part. Emily smiled. The thinking is. Daniel ended his call just in time to hear the final sentence. He quietly watched as Ethan solved the next equation without asking for another hint. I got it, the boy said with visible excitement. Emily nodded proudly. You discovered it yourself. She wished them an enjoyable afternoon before continuing toward another table. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Most adults would have solved the problem for Ethan in less than 30 seconds. Emily had instead taught him how to solve it himself. The difference lingered in Daniel's thoughts long after she walked away. Later that afternoon, another businessman entered the restaurant and immediately recognized Daniel. He approached with a friendly smile before sitting briefly beside the table. Daniel, I heard your acquisition team is close to closing the Harper deal. Daniel nodded cautiously. We are reviewing the final assumptions. The businessman laughed confidently. Those analysts of yours never miss anything. Before Daniel could answer, Emily quietly placed fresh coffee beside the visitor. The businessman thanked her without looking up, continuing his conversation as though she were invisible. He casually mentioned one projected growth figure from the acquisition documents lying open on the table. Emily paused for only a brief second. She spoke with complete politeness. Excuse me, I may have misunderstood what I overheard, but if that projection excludes seasonal contract renewals, the long-term retention estimate might appear stronger than it actually is. The businessman smiled politely, assuming she had simply confused the discussion. Daniel, however, slowly lifted his eyes toward Emily. She offered an apologetic smile. I am sorry if I interrupted. Please enjoy your coffee. Then she quietly walked away. Daniel looked down at the report. The exact page she had unknowingly referenced remained open before him. For the first time since entering the restaurant, curiosity quietly began replacing certainty. Daniel Brooks did not close the report immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the page Emily Carter had quietly referenced before walking away. His business associate smiled dismissively and stirred his coffee. You are not actually considering investment advice from a waitress, are you? Daniel remained silent for a moment. He had built an empire by trusting evidence instead of pride, yet something about Emily's calm confidence refused to leave his thoughts. There had been no attempt to impress anyone, no dramatic speech. She had spoken as though she simply noticed something others might have overlooked. Daniel slowly reopened the report to the customer retention section. The businessman laughed again. Our consulting firm has already reviewed every number. Daniel calmly replied, That is true. Then he added quietly, But sometimes the largest mistakes survive because everyone assumes someone else. Already checked them. Ethan watched his father carefully. It was the first time that afternoon Daniel sounded more curious than certain. Emily continued serving other tables as though nothing unusual had happened. She greeted new customers, refilled coffee cups, and helped an elderly woman carry a heavy shopping bag to a nearby chair before returning to her duties. She never once glanced toward Daniel's table. She seemed completely unaware that one brief observation had interrupted the confidence of one of New York's most respected investors. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the report again. This time he slowly read the assumptions beneath the projected retention model instead of only reviewing the summary. Several footnotes appeared beneath the main chart. One sentence immediately caught his attention. Seasonal contract renewals had been classified separately from long-term customer agreements. Daniel quietly frowned. Ethan noticed the expression. Did she see something important? Daniel answered honestly. I do not know yet. His business associate leaned across the table. Those classifications are standard. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps. He continued reading without another word. 5 minutes later, he closed the report and stood. We are leaving. The businessman looked confused. The meeting? Daniel placed the folder inside his briefcase. It can wait until I verify something. Ethan quietly followed his father toward the restaurant entrance. Before leaving, Daniel paused beside the service station where Emily was organizing clean glasses. She looked up with the same calm smile she had shown every customer throughout the afternoon. I hope you both enjoyed your lunch. Daniel studied her face carefully. May I ask you one question? Emily nodded politely. Of course. Daniel lowered his voice. Earlier you mentioned seasonal renewals. What? Emily hesitated briefly before answering. Because numbers often become misleading when they separate loyal customers from temporary activity. A company can appear healthier than it truly is if people only study the summary instead of asking how the totals were created. Daniel remained silent. Emily continued. Gently. I could certainly be mistaken. I only mentioned it because the discussion reminded me of something I studied a long time ago. There was no arrogance in her voice. Only quiet humility. Daniel slowly nodded. Thank you. Emily smiled warmly. You are welcome. She returned to arranging the glasses exactly as before, never asking another question. As Daniel and Ethan stepped outside into the cool Manhattan afternoon, Ethan looked up at his father. Are you going back to the office? Daniel glanced toward the briefcase in his hand before answering. Yes. Ethan tilted his head. Because of what she said? Daniel looked back through the restaurant window where Emily was already helping another family with gentle patience. No, he replied thoughtfully. Because I have learned never to ignore someone who notices what everyone else walks past. As their car disappeared into the afternoon traffic, Emily quietly continued her shift, completely unaware that the hottest temper in the restaurant had just been replaced by something far more powerful. Genuine respect had begun with a single calm sentence spoken without anger, without pride, and without expecting anything in return. SUA Daniel Brooks arrived at Coal Capital before sunrise the next morning, carrying the same acquisition report that had rested on the restaurant table only hours earlier. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls of his office, while most of Manhattan was still waking. He placed the thick report on the conference table, loosened his tie, and quietly reopened the section Emily Carter had mentioned. This time he ignored every executive summary and carefully examined each supporting assumption hidden beneath the charts. Minutes slowly became nearly an hour. Finally, his chief financial officer entered carrying fresh coffee. You are here early, she said with a surprised smile. Daniel did not look up. Please show me the seasonal contract calculations. She hesitated briefly. Those numbers were already reviewed by the consulting firm. Daniel calmly nodded. I know. Please show them anyway. Several analysts soon joined the meeting, opening spreadsheets and financial models across multiple screens. At first, everything appeared exactly as expected. Then one young analyst quietly frowned while comparing two data sets. Something is not matching, he murmured. The room immediately grew quieter. Daniel stepped closer. Explain. The analyst pointed towards several hidden worksheets buried deep inside the projection model. The long-term retention forecast excludes thousands of seasonal contracts that expire before renewal periods. They are counted differently in the summary than they are in the supporting data. Daniel folded his arms without speaking. Another analyst recalculated the projections using the complete customer base. Within moments, the expected retention rate dropped significantly below the level required to justify the acquisition price. The chief financial officer slowly leaned back in her chair. If we had signed the agreement using the original assumptions, we would have dramatically overvalued the company. Silence settled across the conference room. No one blamed the consulting firm. No one defended the mistake. They simply stared at the revised numbers appearing across the large presentation screen. Daniel quietly closed the report. Suspend the acquisition until every assumption is independently verified. Every executive immediately agreed. After the meeting ended, Daniel remained alone in the conference room, looking toward the Manhattan skyline with thoughtful eyes. One quiet observation from a waitress had just protected his company from an extraordinarily expensive decision. Not because she possessed secret information, but because she had asked the question everyone else overlooked. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily tied the familiar black apron around her waist before the breakfast shift began. She greeted coworkers with warm smiles, prepared fresh coffee, and arranged flowers on each table exactly as she did every morning. Nothing about her routine suggested she had unknowingly changed the course of a major corporate decision. During a short break, she removed a worn finance textbook from her canvas bag and quietly reviewed several pages while sipping tea near the employee entrance. One of the younger servers noticed the thick textbook and laughed kindly. You always study during breaks. Emily smiled softly. A few pages every day become many books over the years. The young server looked curious. Do you ever regret not using all that knowledge somewhere else? Emily gently closed the book before answering. Knowledge never disappears just because the world cannot see it. She returned the textbook to her bag and walked back inside as another group of customers entered the restaurant. At almost the same moment, Daniel stood beside the window of his office thinking about the same quiet woman. For the first time in many years, he realized the most valuable lesson he had learned in business. The following afternoon, Daniel Brooks found himself returning to the same restaurant. Although this time there was no business lunch scheduled and no client waiting inside. Even he could not fully explain why he had come back so soon. He told himself he simply wanted to satisfy his curiosity, yet the truth felt more complicated. Since discovering the hidden flaw in the acquisition model, one quiet question refused to leave his mind. Who was Emily Carter before she became a waitress? When he entered the restaurant, the familiar lunchtime atmosphere had already filled every table. Emily moved gracefully through the dining room with the same calm confidence she had displayed the day before. Nothing about her suggested she knew a billionaire had spent the morning thinking about a conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes. She welcomed new guests, carried trays with steady hands, and smiled warmly at every customer regardless of how they treated her. Daniel chose a table farther from the windows this time, hoping to observe without interrupting her work. Ethan sat across from him, immediately recognizing Emily as she approached with 2 menus. "Welcome back," she said with genuine warmth. "It is nice to see both of you again." Daniel noticed there was not the slightest trace of awkwardness in her voice. She treated him exactly as she treated everyone else. No resentment remained from the previous afternoon. No expectation of gratitude appeared after her unexpected insight had saved his company from an expensive mistake. After taking their order, Emily quietly returned to serving other tables. Daniel watched as she paused beside an elderly customer struggling to read the menu. Instead of rushing away, she patiently described each meal until the gentleman smiled with relief. Moments later, she helped a young mother carry a folded stroller through the narrow aisle before returning to refill another customer's coffee. Every action seemed natural, almost invisible, performed without seeking recognition. Ethan finally spoke. "Dad, she helps everyone the same way." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I noticed." Halfway through lunch, Emily stepped outside for her scheduled break. Daniel looked through the window and saw her sitting alone on a small bench beside the employee entrance. Instead of checking her phone like most people, she removed the same worn finance textbook from her canvas bag. Its pages were marked with handwritten notes, colored tabs, and carefully folded corners from years of study. She quietly underlined several paragraphs before solving equations inside a notebook balanced across her lap. Daniel watched silently from inside the restaurant. There was no audience, no interview, no examination. She studied simply because learning mattered to her. A few minutes later, one of the restaurant managers stepped outside carrying 2 bottled waters. He smiled kindly before sitting beside Emily. Daniel could not hear every word through the glass, but he noticed the manager pointing toward the textbook with an encouraging expression. Emily laughed softly and answered with modesty rather than pride. When the short break ended, she carefully placed the old textbook back inside her canvas bag, stood, adjusted her black apron, and returned to work with the same quiet smile she had worn all afternoon. Daniel lowered his eyes thoughtfully. He had spent decades interviewing graduates from prestigious universities, reviewing remarkable resumes, and searching for extraordinary talent in predictable places. Yet the person who had impressed him most was studying alone on a restaurant bench during a 15-minute break, asking for nothing except another chance to learn. For the first time in many years, Daniel realized that ability often hides behind ordinary uniforms, waiting only for someone willing to look beyond them. 2 days later, a quiet decision made behind the glass walls of Cole Capital began setting an unexpected chain of events into motion. Daniel Brooks gathered his executive leadership team inside the company's largest conference room, where morning sunlight reflected across polished oak tables and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The acquisition project remained suspended while every department completed a full independent review. After the meeting concluded, Daniel remained seated, thoughtfully tapping a pen against the folder lying before him. His chief human resources officer noticed the unusual silence. Is something still bothering you about the acquisition? She asked. Daniel looked toward the skyline before answering. Not the acquisition. The way we discover talent. The executive waited patiently. Daniel continued. We spend millions recruiting graduates with perfect resumes. Yet someone outside our entire system noticed a flaw that every consultant missed. The room became quiet. Finally, he spoke again. I want to launch an open analyst assessment. No referrals. No preferred universities. No executive recommendations. Anyone may apply if they can pass every stage fairly. Several executives exchanged curious glances. One senior manager smiled politely. That could attract thousands of applicants. Daniel nodded. Good. Ability should never depend on where someone starts. The proposal was approved before lunch. Within hours, Cole Capital published a nationwide announcement inviting candidates from every background to participate in a rigorous financial analyst evaluation. There would be written assessments, case studies, ethical decision exercises, and practical business analysis. Every applicant would receive the same opportunity. Meanwhile, Emily Carter knew nothing about the discussion taking place several miles away. Her afternoon shift had just ended. After changing into a light gray sweater and carrying her familiar canvas bag, she stopped at a neighborhood library before walking home. She greeted the librarian by name and quietly borrowed 2 books on corporate valuation and strategic risk management. The librarian smiled warmly. You always choose the difficult ones. Emily laughed softly. They become easier one page at a time. Later that evening, she returned to her modest apartment, where a small wooden desk stood beside a single window overlooking the city street below. A neatly folded black apron rested across the back of her chair. She prepared a simple dinner, poured herself a cup of tea, and opened her laptop. As she checked her email, one new message immediately caught her attention. It was a career newsletter she had subscribed to years earlier. Across the top appeared an announcement from Cole Capital inviting applicants to participate in a newly created analyst selection program. Emily read every requirement carefully. There was no promise of guaranteed employment. Only an opportunity to compete fairly. She quietly leaned back in her chair, her eyes resting on the application page without touching the keyboard. She had dreamed about returning to finance for years, but life had repeatedly placed family responsibilities before personal ambition. Her education had been interrupted. Bills had to be paid. Working as a waitress had provided stability while her dreams patiently waited beside stacks of textbooks and late-night study sessions. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening the application again. There was no excitement on her face, only thoughtful determination. She printed the requirements, placed them neatly beside her finance books, and whispered one quiet sentence to herself. If the opportunity is honest, I should at least be honest enough to try. Across the city, Daniel looked out over the glowing skyline from his office, unaware that the woman who had quietly changed his thinking was now reading the opportunity he had created. Neither of them realized that the next chapter of their lives would no longer unfold across a restaurant table, but within a test designed to measure something far greater than titles, appearances, or first impressions. 1 week later, hundreds of applicants gathered inside the modern headquarters of Cole Capital, their conversations echoing softly through the spacious lobby beneath towering glass walls and polished marble floors. Some carried graduate degrees from prestigious universities. Others arrived wearing expensive business suits with impressive resumes neatly organized inside leather portfolios. Emily Carter entered quietly through the revolving doors wearing a simple navy business suit she had purchased several years earlier for interviews that had never happened. Her familiar canvas bag rested lightly over one shoulder, carrying only a notebook, several sharpened pencils, and the same determination that had quietly guided her through countless nights of study. She signed her name at the registration desk without attracting attention. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew she spent her mornings serving coffee inside a Manhattan restaurant before studying finance during every available break. That anonymity felt strangely comforting. She had not come to prove anyone wrong. She had simply come to discover whether years of quiet preparation could finally meet an honest opportunity. Across the building, Daniel Brooks observed the registration process from an upper conference room through a wall of glass overlooking the lobby below. His chief human resources officer approached with a tablet containing applicant statistics. More than 3,000 people applied, she reported. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Good. The process begins today, and names should remain hidden during evaluation. I want every submission identified only by candidate number. She smiled. Everything has already been arranged. Daniel looked once more toward the lobby. He noticed Emily standing patiently in line, but made no attempt to approach her. If she participated, she deserved the same fairness as everyone else. The first assessment began inside a large examination hall where rows of individual desks stretched across the room beneath bright natural light. Each candidate received identical case studies involving investment analysis, financial forecasting, ethical decision-making, and business risk evaluation. Emily, carefully read every instruction before writing a single word. She ignored the nervous energy surrounding her and focused only on understanding each problem completely before reaching a conclusion. Around her, several applicants hurried through the questions, confident that speed demonstrated intelligence. Emily chose patience instead. Every calculation was checked twice. Every assumption was clearly explained. Every recommendation included both financial consequences and human impact. Hours passed almost unnoticed. When the examination concluded, candidates quietly submitted their work before leaving the room. Emily smiled politely to the proctor, collected her notebook, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. She did not discuss the questions with anyone waiting outside. She simply accepted that she had done her best. Meanwhile, the anonymous answer sheets arrived inside a secure evaluation room, where Daniel and several senior executives reviewed only candidate numbers without personal information attached. One analysis immediately drew the attention of every evaluator. Instead of recommending the highest projected financial return, the candidate identified hidden long-term operational risks, questioned unrealistic customer retention assumptions, and proposed a more sustainable strategy balancing profitability with lasting trust. Daniel slowly reread the final paragraph. The reasoning felt remarkably familiar. Calm, logical, free from unnecessary complexity. One executive looked impressed. Whoever candidate 1847 is, this person thinks differently. Daniel quietly agreed, but said nothing more. The evaluation continued late into the evening while Emily returned home, changed back into comfortable clothes, and folded her black apron for the following morning's restaurant shift. She prepared a simple dinner, opened another finance book, and resumed studying without knowing that somewhere across Manhattan, a group of experienced executives had spent nearly an hour discussing the anonymous work she believed was only one submission among thousands. The journey she had quietly pursued for years had finally begun moving forward, one honest step at a time. SUA 3 days later, an email arrived in Emily Carter's inbox while she was preparing for another morning shift at the restaurant. She quietly read the subject line twice before opening it. Candidate 1847 had successfully advanced to the second stage of Cole Capital's analyst selection program. There was no celebration. She simply smiled, folded the printed invitation carefully, and placed it inside the finance textbook she carried every day. Then she tied her familiar black apron around her waist and welcomed the first customers of the morning with the same warmth she always offered. Throughout the breakfast rush, she never mentioned the invitation to anyone. Every table received the same careful attention. Every coffee cup was refilled before being requested. Every customer left feeling respected. Late that afternoon, Emily arrived once again at Cole Capital, where the second assessment focused on practical decision-making rather than technical calculations. Small groups of anonymous candidates were assigned realistic business situations requiring cooperation, ethical judgment, and leadership under pressure. The evaluators observed quietly from behind one-way glass without revealing their identities. Daniel Brooks watched beside several senior executives, reviewing only candidate numbers while refusing to learn anyone's name until the evaluation concluded. The exercise presented each group with a difficult scenario. A profitable investment promised exceptional short-term returns, but required reducing support for long-standing community programs serving loyal customers. Several candidates immediately argued that maximizing quarterly profits should remain the company's highest priority. Others defended emotional decisions without supporting evidence. Candidate 1847 remained silent for several minutes, carefully listening before speaking. Finally, Emily calmly explained that sustainable companies rarely succeed by forcing a choice between profit and principle. She outlined a strategy preserving essential community partnerships while restructuring operating costs through efficiency improvements instead of eliminating meaningful commitments. Her proposal included measurable financial projections, realistic implementation steps, and long-term customer retention benefits supported by clear reasoning. She never interrupted another candidate. She acknowledged strong ideas before respectfully explaining where she believed hidden risks existed. Gradually, the entire discussion became more thoughtful. Several candidates who had initially disagreed began expanding her ideas instead of competing against them. Behind the observation glass, one executive quietly whispered, "She leads without trying to control anyone." Daniel nodded almost immediately. Because people trust those who listen before speaking. Another evaluator pointed toward candidate 1847's written notes. "Look at the structure. Every recommendation balances financial discipline with human responsibility." Daniel remained thoughtful. Something about the analytical style continued reminding him of the quiet waitress who had changed his thinking inside a Manhattan restaurant. Yet he deliberately refused to ask for the candidate's identity. If his instincts were wrong, he wanted the process to remain completely fair. When the exercise ended, Emily thanked every member of her discussion group before quietly leaving the building alone. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the plaza as she walked toward the subway carrying her canvas bag over one shoulder. She never looked back at the headquarters. She believed her future would depend only on the quality of her work, not on whether anyone are. SUA, the final stage of the selection process, arrived on a bright Monday morning, and only 12 anonymous candidates remained. Emily Carter quietly entered the headquarters of Cole Capital carrying the same canvas bag that had accompanied her through years of early morning shifts, late-night study sessions, and countless library visits. She paused for a moment inside the spacious lobby, took a slow breath, and smiled gently before checking in at the reception desk. The receptionist handed her a visitor badge displaying only candidate 1847. No names appeared anywhere in the evaluation center. Everyone would succeed or fail based entirely on merit. Upstairs, Daniel Brooks reviewed the schedule with the executive committee. The final assessment would not measure mathematical ability alone. Every remaining candidate had already demonstrated strong technical knowledge. Today would reveal something far more important. Each applicant would receive a realistic business crisis requiring ethical judgment, strategic thinking, and the courage to defend difficult decisions under questioning. Daniel quietly reminded every evaluator of one rule. Challenge every assumption equally. Nobody receives easier questions, and nobody receives harder ones. Fairness must remain visible. The committee agreed without hesitation. Emily entered a modern conference room where a sealed folder waited beside a glass of water. She opened the documents and carefully studied the scenario. A successful regional company faced unexpected financial pressure. Closing several community support programs would immediately improve quarterly earnings and satisfy investors. But thousands of loyal customers depended upon those services. Preserving every program, however, could weaken future growth if no alternative strategy emerged. Emily read every page twice before writing a single note. When the presentation began, she stood calmly before the evaluation panel. Unknown to her, Daniel observed from an adjoining room through a live video feed while candidate identities remained hidden. Emily began speaking with quiet confidence rather than dramatic enthusiasm. She acknowledged the financial realities without ignoring the human consequences. Instead of choosing between profit and compassion, she proposed restructuring administrative expenses, investing in operational efficiency, strengthening customer loyalty initiatives, and gradually modernizing outdated systems before reducing programs that communities genuinely depended upon. Every recommendation included measurable financial projections, realistic timelines, and clearly explained risks. When one evaluator challenged her assumptions, Emily did not become defensive. She thanked the evaluator for the question, carefully reconsidered the concern, and explained why long-term trust often creates stronger financial performance than short-term cost reductions alone. Another executive intentionally presented an opposing viewpoint. Emily listened completely before responding. She agreed where the argument contained merit, then calmly identified overlooked variables supported by evidence rather than emotion. Inside the observation room, Silence gradually replaced discussion among the executives. Daniel watched the presentation without speaking. The same qualities he had first noticed inside the restaurant appeared once again. Careful listening, respectful confidence, clear reasoning, humility without hesitation. When the final question concluded, Emily thanked the panel for their time, collected her notebook, and quietly left the room. She never asked how she had performed. She believed honest work should speak before personal ambition. After the door closed, the evaluators remained seated for several long moments. One senior executive finally looked around the table. Candidate 1847 demonstrated the strongest balance of judgment, ethics, leadership, and financial reasoning we have seen in years. Another slowly nodded. This person improves every conversation without trying to dominate it. Daniel quietly closed. The executive conference room remained quiet long after the final evaluation scores had been submitted. Every candidate had demonstrated impressive abilities, yet one anonymous file consistently ranked at the very top in every category. Candidate 1847 had earned the highest combined score in analytical thinking, ethical judgment, communication, leadership, and long-term strategic planning. Daniel Brooks slowly reviewed the final evaluation summary one last time before looking toward the committee. "Has anyone identified this candidate?" he asked. The Director of Human Resources smiled slightly and shook her head. "Not yet. Per your instructions, every evaluation remained anonymous until the final decision was complete." Daniel nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Then the process worked exactly as it should." One senior executive leaned forward with obvious curiosity. "Should we finally open the identity file?" Daniel rested his hands calmly on the conference table. "Yes." The Human Resources Director entered a secure password before the candidate profile appeared on the large presentation screen. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Then the room became completely silent. A professional photograph filled the display. Emily Carter. Beneath her name appeared her employment history. Current occupation, restaurant waitress. Daniel stared quietly at the screen without moving. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. One softly whispered, "This cannot be the same woman." Daniel recognized the familiar calm smile immediately. The same young waitress who had stood before him with quiet dignity after the coffee incident. The same woman who had gently encouraged Ethan to understand mathematics instead of memorizing formulas. The same person whose brief observation had prevented a costly acquisition mistake. She had entered the competition without asking for special treatment, without mentioning their previous meetings, and without ever revealing her identity. She had earned every point entirely on her own. Daniel slowly stood and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. After several thoughtful moments, he quietly said, "She never wanted an advantage. She wanted an opportunity." No one answered because everyone understood the truth of those words. The Human Resources Director continued reviewing Emily's background. Her university studies had been interrupted several years earlier after unexpected family responsibilities required full-time employment. Despite that challenge, she had continued studying independently while working long restaurant shifts. Professional certifications, library programs, online coursework, and years of personal research filled the remainder of her file. One executive looked genuinely moved. She built this knowledge without the resources most applicants had. Daniel nodded slowly, which makes her achievement even more remarkable. That afternoon, Emily completed another busy shift inside the restaurant, completely unaware that her identity had finally been revealed inside the headquarters of Cole Capital. She thanked her coworkers before changing out of her black apron and preparing to leave. As she walked toward the employee entrance, the restaurant manager smiled warmly. "Emily, you always seem peaceful, even on difficult days. What is your secret?" Emily thought quietly before answering. "I cannot control when opportunities arrive. I can only decide whether I will be ready when they do." The manager smiled with quiet admiration. Emily adjusted the canvas bag resting on her shoulder and stepped into the cool evening air, believing she would simply return home and prepare for another ordinary day. Across the city, however, Daniel had already made one final decision. There would be no celebration based on sympathy, no recognition because she had once served coffee, and no reward for overcoming hardship alone. Emily Carter would receive exactly what she had earned through years of discipline, preparation, humility, and quiet excellence. For the first time since they had met, Daniel realized the woman he once judged by her apron had never needed anyone to lower the standard for her. She had quietly raised it for everyone around her. The following Friday afternoon, Emily Carter received a brief email inviting her to return to the headquarters of Coal Capital for the final announcement. The message contained no promises and revealed nothing about the outcome. It simply requested her presence at 2 o'clock. Emily quietly folded the printed invitation and placed it inside her notebook before finishing another lunch shift at the restaurant. She thanked each coworker before removing her black apron, carefully folding it into her familiar canvas bag, and changing into the same simple navy business suit she had worn throughout the selection process. As she entered the company headquarters, several other finalists were already waiting inside the executive conference center. Friendly conversations filled the room, but Emily remained quietly seated near the windows overlooking Manhattan, reading a few handwritten notes she had carried for years. She had already accepted whatever decision awaited her. The opportunity itself had been worth the effort. A few minutes later, the finalists were invited into the boardroom. Daniel Brooks stood at the front beside the executive leadership team. The atmosphere felt respectful rather than dramatic. Daniel welcomed every candidate before speaking. Over the past several weeks, each of you demonstrated remarkable ability, integrity, and determination. Every evaluation was conducted anonymously because we wanted one principle to remain true from beginning to end. Opportunity should belong to preparation, not reputation. Several executives nodded quietly. Daniel continued. Today we are revealing the results only after every score has been finalized. The Human Resources Director stepped forward holding a sealed folder. She announced the names of several finalists who would receive future opportunities within the company. Warm applause filled the room after each announcement. Emily sincerely applauded every candidate beside her, never expecting to hear her own name. Finally, the director paused before smiling gently. The highest overall evaluation, Candidate 1847, has been awarded the position of Financial Strategy Analyst. She looked toward the audience. Emily Carter. For a brief moment, Emily remained completely still. She looked around as though expecting someone else to stand. Only after the people nearby began smiling toward her did she quietly rise from her chair. The room filled with warm applause. Daniel watched as Emily walked calmly toward the front without triumph or disbelief, only quiet gratitude. Once she reached the stage, Daniel extended his hand. Emily accepted the handshake with the same respectful composure she had shown inside the restaurant weeks earlier. Daniel looked directly into her eyes before speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. There is something I need to say before we continue. The applause gradually faded. Daniel took a slow breath. When I first met Emily, I judged her far too quickly. I allowed appearance and occupation to shape my opinion before I understood the person standing in front of me. That was my mistake. The room remained completely silent. Daniel continued. She never asked for special treatment. She never mentioned that we had already met. She entered this process anonymously and earned every single result through discipline, integrity, and extraordinary ability. Today I am not offering her an opportunity. I am recognizing one she has already earned. Emily smiled gently before answering in the same quiet voice everyone remembered. Thank you. I believe respect grows strongest when it is shared, not when it is won. Several executives lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Even Ethan, standing quietly beside the entrance after school had ended, smiled proudly as he watched the exchange. Daniel realized that the lesson he wanted his son to remember had finally become real. Greatness was never announced by expensive titles or powerful voices. Sometimes it arrived wearing a simple black apron, carrying a worn canvas bag, and quietly proving every assumption wrong through patience, humility, and unwavering character. Several weeks passed, and the rhythm of life quietly settled into something new without losing the values that had guided it from the beginning. Every morning, Emily Carter entered the headquarters of Coal Capital carrying the same canvas bag she had once brought to the restaurant. Inside it remained the neatly folded black apron she had decided never to throw away. It reminded her that dignity had never come from a job title. It had always come from the way she treated people when nobody was watching. Her new office overlooked the Manhattan skyline, yet she still arrived early each day, prepared her own coffee, greeted the reception staff by name, and thanked every member of the maintenance team before beginning work. Those small habits never changed because success had not changed the person she had always been. Her thoughtful recommendations soon earned the confidence of every department. She listened carefully before speaking, encouraged younger analysts to ask difficult questions, and reminded experienced executives that the strongest ideas often began with simple observations. Meetings gradually became less about proving who was right and more about discovering what was right. Daniel Brooks noticed the change with quiet satisfaction. He no longer measured leadership by the loudest voice inside the room. Instead, he watched how people made others feel after every conversation ended. One afternoon, Ethan visited the office after school. Emily welcomed him with the same warm smile she had shown the first day they met inside the restaurant. She asked about his mathematics class, and Ethan proudly explained that he had started solving problems by understanding the ideas instead of memorizing formulas. Daniel listened silently from across the room before smiling. That single lesson had grown far beyond a worksheet. Months later, the restaurant where everything had begun celebrated its anniversary. Emily returned after work carrying a small bouquet of flowers for the manager and every coworker who had supported her through difficult years. She spent the evening helping serve tables during the busiest hours simply because the team needed an extra pair of hands. Several surprised customers recognized the financial analyst from recent business news and asked why she was still wearing a black apron. Emily smiled gently before answering. "This apron reminds me where discipline, patience, and gratitude were built. I have no reason to hide it." Near the end of the evening, the front door opened, and Daniel entered beside Ethan. This time there were no raised voices, no hurried business calls, and no expectations beyond sharing a quiet dinner together. Emily welcomed them exactly as she welcomed every other guest. Daniel thanked her before taking his seat. As they prepared to leave, he paused beside the service station where their story had truly begun. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Not for helping my company, for helping me become a better example for my son." Emily's smile remained calm. "We all teach each other something. We simply do not always notice it at first." Ethan looked at the folded apron resting beside her canvas bag and then at his father. Without saying another word, he understood why both had become symbols of respect instead of status. As father and son stepped into the quiet Manhattan evening, the city lights reflected across the sidewalks just as they had on the day everything changed. Inside the restaurant, Emily returned to helping her co-workers with the same quiet grace that had always defined her. Some people spend their lives searching for extraordinary heroes, never realizing they may have already met one while ordering a simple cup of coffee. The world often notices success only after it becomes visible, but true character is built long before anyone chooses to look.